Howdy. Just a reminder, I don't mention this in every video, but I like to do it now and again. I don't upload these necessarily in the order I record them, and that may not make a difference with some of the videos. I'm not planning on mentioning the date in this one, but sometimes I'll do that. And so you might get one I recorded on the 30th of the month, 2 weeks before you get one I recorded on the 1st. And now that I've said that, I don't remember why I bothered. But then whoever said I was intelligent had never met me. Today, it's going to be a sippin' and talkin' video. And I want to begin by saying something that will surely shock the living daylights out of you. I have never tried every whiskey there is. Yeah, I know, it's unbelievable that somebody who's been drinking whiskey all of 4 years. I am going to mention the date because it's actually relevant to that. It is now 12:08. On the 20th of September 2025. That means that it is today my 4th anniversary drinking whiskey. I'm not going to go into that story, but yeah, turns out the date's relevant after all. I have been drinking whiskey for 4 years. But I haven't drank them all. And one that until recently I had never tried is Wild Turkey 101 Rye. I like the bourbon, but I'd not had their rye before. Now, I've already opened this. On the day I got it, that's my custom. I open it up and I post my first impressions on MeWe, sometimes just in the Bourbon Aficionados group, sometimes in all 3 groups I'm in. The other 2 are Whiskey and Whiskey, using the 2 spellings, and one just called Whiskey. But my first glass of this did not impress me. And so this came up in the rotation, and I decided to do a second first impressions here. Okay. Because of the way I'm recording these days, well, that's going to have to do on the label. Because of the way I'm recording these days, it's easier for me when I pour the bottle on camera to look at the screen and see the level I poured to. Otherwise, I'd hold it up like this. And if I go like that, it's just easier for me to go by what I saw on the screen. And something about the tilt of the camera meant that I poured more than I actually thought I did, more than I intended. Now, this is whiskey for beginners, so I briefly want to go into what rye whiskey is if you're a beginner and you're not sure. By U.S. law, to be rye whiskey, the recipe, the mash bill is what we call it, must be at least 51% rye. The other 49% can be anything as long as it's a grain. Corn, wheat, barley, sorghum, whatever. I have not looked up the mash bill on this. I know that it does have rye as the majority grain. I would assume that the other 2 grains are corn and barley. That's standard for a rye whiskey. Although MGP, which is a huge distillery that makes mostly stuff for other people, other organizations, I should say. It has a 95.5 rye, 95% rye, 5% barley, that can come out pretty good. But I don't know what the mash bill is on this, other than it's at least 51% rye. And I want to mention the phenomenon of the neck pour. Now, I've done a video on that in my Whiskey Basics playlist. It is not near the quality of this, and this is still a thoroughly amateur production. That hasn't changed. It's just a less abominably bad, thoroughly amateur production. But you can go into that Whiskey Basics playlist and you can find a video I did on the neck pour. Basically, it's the idea that the whiskey up here in the neck is not as good as the rest of the whiskey. The idea that the first glass, essentially, is not as good. I'm of two minds about that. On the one hand, I have had bottles where the first glass wasn't so hot. After that, it got better. But on the other hand, I've had bottles where the first glass was the best glass, and it went downhill from there, in a couple of cases very precipitously downhill. And then most of the whiskey I've had, including bottles that I call my standards, the first glass is just as good as the last glass, and vice versa. Now, there are people who swear that the neck pour is universal. They don't. I've heard of people who just pour out what's in the neck. You paid for it. Drink it. You're throwing money down the sink. But that's my view. You know, if they view it otherwise, well, they're entitled to be wrong. See, you got to understand, I'm right. I've always been right. I'll always be right. Until I argue with my wife, and then I'm wrong, and I've learned to admit it right off and save a lot of trouble. That is a rye whiskey. Now, I didn't get this on the first glass, but on that very first sniff, I definitely got the vegetal and something of the mineral characteristics that, for me, characterize rye whiskey. Other people, they get pine trees, they get dill. And by the way, you do not get a dill at the car dealer. That's a deal. Dill is what you make dill pickles with. Pronounce things right, people. There's three ways to speak English: the Texas way, the Southern way, and the wrong way. If you ain't doing it Texan or Southern, you're doing it wrong. Definitely thoroughly vegetal. And I can't differentiate out anything specific. It's just a smell of vegetables. Leaves is what comes to me, not just tree leaves. If I had to specify one single plant, it would be a mullein. And sometimes they call it lamb's ears, sometimes probably various other things. But it's got it's got this hairy appearance, and it has the leaves in a spread at the ground level, and then the spike shoots up and swells out at the top into the flower head, and that's where the flowers bloom. And when we were kids living for 3 years in Clayton, Washington, we would break off the mullein stalks after they'd flowered and seeded and dried, and we'd sword fight with them. And by the way, it's not that anybody taught us to play sword fighting. It just come naturally to us. You don't have to teach a child to sin. You don't have to teach a human being even fake violence. It comes naturally to us. What doesn't come naturally is being peaceable. I think there might be some pine needles in there actually, and I've never got that from a rye before. I don't think I'm getting any dill, but this is smelling a lot better than it did on the first glass. Definitely vegetal, possibly pine needles. Yeah, that's what I'm getting. And I'm not going to really do a real thorough picking apart of this nose. That's not what a sipping and talking video is about. That is a nice creamy mouthfeel. I don't remember the mouthfeel impressing me on the first glass, but here it did. The thickest mouthfeel I've ever encountered is on Wild Turkey Rare Breed Bourbon. I've not this, as I say, this is the first Wild Turkey rye I've ever had. But that Rare Breed Bourbon has got a thick mouthfeel. This, I think, might be second. And now, I won't swear to that, because I've had some thick mouthfeels here and there. As a general rule, the thicker the mouthfeel, the better the whiskey. But not necessarily. It's not Bluff Springs. It's not a spectacularly thick mouthfeel, but it's good whiskey. Knob Creek, of any variety that I've had, does not have a conspicuously thick mouthfeel, but it's very good whiskey. So it's a rule of thumb, but the thing about a rule of thumb is sometimes the thumb ain't in the picture. You get your pinky finger or what have you. I think I got a little butter on the nose that time. And the dill might be in there. There might be dill. Which, if I'm really getting dill, and as I say, I'm not trying to pick it apart in detail, but if I am, it's the first dill I've ever got off of rye whiskey. I got honey first off, then I got cinnamon, and then I believe I did get a dill note on the palate. Now it may be, I hope you'll forgive me cutting the top of my head off. I had to scratch my back, or in the country terms, I had to itch my back. Sometimes in the South, one word, whether a noun or a verb, has been made to serve the purposes of both. You know, you go to school and you learn things because the teacher learns you, you learn math because the teacher learns you math. You know, you scratch because it itches, but you're itching it. So, we have come up with a lot of new words, upscuttle, sygogglin, new ways to use existing words, but sometimes we've compressed the noun and the verb into one word. But I can't remember where I was before I started talking about scratching my back. But that's the thing about a sipping and talking video. If this is the first one you've run across, and that I'm sipping whiskey and I'm talking about whatever comes to my mind. Now, the nose isn't getting any different. I'm not getting anything new on the palate as far as specific notes, but the overall impression is of walking in a cool pine forest. And there are what they call bourbon drinkers' ryes. Hard Truth out of Nashville, Indiana. Nashville, Brown County, Indiana. And I think I've remembered not just the city and the state, but the county, because it is so odd to me to find a Nashville north of the Mason-Dixon line producing good whiskey. You know, I don't know why it should surprise me. Rye whiskey's been around for a good while. But Hard Truth up there in Nashville produces two varieties of rye that I've had. One is the Sweet Mash Rye, which is about $70, and it's, if I remember right, 103 proof. And then there's the High Road Rye, which is about $40 and 93 proof. And those two are rye whiskeys. If you pay attention, you will detect the rye in them, but they are similar in their flavor profile to bourbon. They're rye or bourbon drinkers' ryes. This ain't, at least not in my nose and on my palate. This is a rye whiskey. Definitely a rye whiskey. And Sagamore Spirit puts out a definite rye whiskey. And there are different varieties of rye. You have your Kentucky rye, which tends to be more like bourbon because most of it's coming from distilleries which primarily make bourbon. And so they're just adapting their bourbon processes to rye grain. There's what they call Monongahela rye. Comes from the I said it, now I can't say it again. Comes from the Monongahela Valley area of Pennsylvania originally. And it had a specific recipe. And Old Overholt, if I'm not mistaken, if I'm remembering correctly, is an example of a Monongahela rye, although Jim Beam makes it. And there's a Maryland rye. And Sagamore Spirit, which I've already mentioned, is in Maryland. And if I'm remembering correctly, they kind of revived the Maryland rye tradition that had gone moribund, if not completely dead. I am not a whiskey history expert, especially when it comes to anything that ain't bourbon. But there are different varieties of rye whiskey. Some are very close to bourbon. Some are definitely not bourbon. This, to me, tonight, is not only considerably better than that first glass was, but it is definitely not something you'll mistake for bourbon. Nothing new on the palate. But when I swallow, the alcohol, which had not been burning at all, suddenly blazes a kind of a moderate fire right down the center of my tongue, and it is warm right in here, and of course the hug is going down as the whiskey does. And while I was talking about that, I lost specific flavor notes. I'm not sure what to think about that finish. there is a taste that I can tell has multiple components to it, but I'm not getting the specific components. It's just the overall taste. And it's kind of a woody, vegetal, mineral mingled taste on the finish. But like I say, this isn't a natural review, so I'm not going to worry about that further. But let me tell you something about the whiskey itself. I got this on the 15th, so 5 days ago, today being, as I record, today being the 20th. Got it at Kelly Liquors in the Mountain Run location here in Albuquerque. Kelly Liquors is a New Mexico chain. They've got several stores here in Albuquerque, one in Santa Fe. I believe there might be one down in Belen or Los Lunas or somewhere south. But that's where I got it. Cost me $26.99, which is not a bad price at all for a bottle of whiskey, 27 bucks. And from a major distillery. I can't remember who owns Wild Turkey. Very few distilleries are independent. The only one offhand I can think of that's a major international distillery here in the States is Heaven Hill. That's in the hands of the Shapira family. And that's not just a southern pronunciation. The last letter of the word is A, not O. A, Shapira. And it's been in, they founded it, a group, several brothers from founded the Heaven Hill Distillery. It's still in the Shapira family. And I hope it stays that way. Everybody else is part of this, these big international conglomerates. But I can't remember who owns Wild Turkey. I don't believe it's Diageo. I don't believe it's Beam Suntory. It might be, and I'm going to mangle the pronunciation. I speak no French. I sound it out. Pernod Ricard. That's what it looks like on paper. I think that might be who owns the turkey, but don't hold me to it. And I can't remember where I was going with that. Never mind. It's sipping and talking. Where are we? We're at 23 minutes. How many minutes in a minute? And that reminds me that the plural of mouse is mice, the plural of mice is meese, the plural of meese is moose, and the plural of moose is mouse. You got a circle there. And yes, I'm totally nuts. I don't suffer from insanity. I enjoy it. If you didn't know I'm crazy, yeah, I am. Not even crazy like a fox, neither. Definitely pine trees on the nose now. Okay, this time on the finish, there's that alcohol run down the middle of my tongue. But there's brown sugar and cinnamon mingled right at the front of my tongue. And I'm tasting a little bit of oak following after that alcohol. And oak, as long as it's not too much, is good. Now for me, usually, not always, usually oak turns into chocolate. Sometimes milk chocolate, usually dark chocolate. Today, with this whiskey, it's staying oak, but that's okay. Aaron on Stuff and Whiskey, I think, overuses it, but she'll say, it tastes like this, or it smells like that, but in a good way. You know, this is oak, in a good way. You wouldn't think that wood would be a good taste, but whiskey is an interesting deal, and probably all aged liquor, has that to an extent. Even tequila, where reposado, rested is what it means in English, although another verb for rest is descansar, so descansado would be rested, but sometimes Spanish has two verbs for the same thing. To know. Conozco is, or conocer is the verb I would use to say I know a person. Conozco a mi amiga. I know my friend. Saber is when you know a thing. And it's an irregular verb, so it'll sound weird after you heard saber. But sé hablar un poco de español. I know how to speak a little Spanish. And so you have reposar, I believe, is the verb that from which we get reposado. And descansar is when you rest. Reposado is kind of, it reposed in the oak. And no, I'm not an expert in Spanish, so I could be wrong. But I've been dealing with the language enough, for long enough, that generally when I get a new verb or a new noun, I get the sense of it as Spanish speakers use it. I have enough of that way of thinking in my head. And I'm tangling myself up. I'm getting into areas where I'm not sure I can explain myself. Anyway, 26 minutes, which is 6 minutes longer than I intended to be. And so, oh shoot, there was something right at the tip of my mind and I lost it. Friends, family, whoever's out there watching, yeehaw!